What if the buildings we call churches were never really built for prayer? That question might feel strange at first, even slightly uncomfortable. Churches are everywhere. They exist in almost every country, in almost every culture that has been touched by Christianity. They are some of the most photographed, most written about, most visited structures on the planet. Entire academic departments are dedicated to their study. Architectural historians spend careers analyzing their construction. Religious scholars spend lifetimes interpreting their meaning. And yet, despite all of that attention, despite all of that documentation, there are details inside many of these buildings that remain genuinely difficult to explain. Not mysterious in a dramatic way. Not impossible. Just unclear. And that lack of clarity is worth sitting with for a moment. Because when something has been studied this thoroughly, and questions still remain, that itself is unusual. Most structures from the medieval period are not deeply mysterious. We understand how Roman aqueducts worked. We understand the engineering behind ancient bridges. We have reasonable explanations for the construction techniques used in most historical architecture. So when a category of buildings, one of the most studied categories in all of human history, continues to produce features that experts describe in vague terms, that pattern deserves attention. Not alarm, just careful, honest attention. The first thing to understand is what kind of details we are actually talking about. This is not about dramatic hidden rooms or secret passages, the kind of imagery that appears in popular fiction. The features that raise real questions are quieter than that. They are technical, they are structural, and in many cases, they are hiding in plain sight, visible to anyone who visits these buildings and knows what to look for. The issue is not that these features are concealed. The issue is that the explanations for them tend to be thin, surface level, the kind of answer that technically responds to the question without actually resolving it. Take the acoustic properties of certain historic church buildings. This is one of the clearest examples, and it is worth examining carefully. In a number of medieval cathedrals and older church structures, sound behaves in ways that modern acoustic engineers find genuinely impressive. Certain frequencies resonate through the entire space in an unusually controlled way. Whispered words spoken near one wall can be heard clearly on the opposite side of the building. Specific chambers within the structure amplify particular tones while suppressing others. These are not minor effects. They are measurable, repeatable, and in some cases sophisticated enough that contemporary recording studios have been designed with these ancient spaces as reference points. Now, the standard explanation for this is that medieval builders were skilled craftsmen who learned through experience. Over generations, they developed an intuition for how stone, height, and curve affected sound. They made adjustments. They refined their techniques. And eventually, they produced buildings with remarkable acoustic qualities. That explanation is reasonable. It is not impossible. But it raises a question that doesn't get asked very often. Where is the record of that learning process? Trial and error leaves evidence. It leaves buildings that didn't work well, structures that were corrected, archives of experimentation. And yet, in many of the most acoustically sophisticated church buildings, there's no surviving documentation of acoustic planning. No notes, no diagrams showing how the builders thought about sound. The effect exists. The intention is invisible. And acoustics are only one part of this. There is also the matter of geometry. Many historic church buildings, when measured carefully, reveal mathematical proportions that go beyond what simple religious symbolism would require. The ratio of the nave's length to its width, the relationship between the height of the ceiling and the width of the transept, the placement of columns at intervals that correspond to specific numerical sequences. These proportions appear again and again across different buildings, built in different countries, by different builders, in different centuries. Some researchers have pointed to the influence of traveling architectural guilds, organized groups of builders who carried knowledge from site to site across medieval Europe. That is a legitimate and documented phenomenon, but it does not fully explain the earliest examples, which predate the well-documented guilds. And it does not explain why those proportions were considered important enough to protect and pass down with such consistency. This is where the explanation starts to weaken. Not collapse, weaken. There's a difference. A weakened explanation is one that still functions as a partial answer but leaves visible gaps. And the gaps in the standard account of church architecture are not small. They are specific, technical, and resistant to easy resolution. When researchers raise them in academic settings, the responses tend to fall into a familiar pattern. The unusual feature is acknowledged. A symbolic or practical explanation is offered, and then the conversation moves on. The deeper question, why does this feature exist at precisely this level of technical complexity, tends not to be pursued. It is also worth considering where many of these buildings were constructed. A significant number of historic churches, including some of the most famous ones in Europe, were built on sites that were considered sacred long before Christianity arrived in those regions. This is openly acknowledged by historians and was, in fact, a documented policy of early church expansion. Converting existing sacred sites was understood to be an effective strategy for bringing local populations into the new faith. Keep the location, change the meaning, replace the old rituals with new ones. This approach made practical sense, and the historical record confirms it was used deliberately. But this acknowledgement opens a question that is rarely followed through. If the site was already sacred, already held in a particular kind of significance by the people who lived there before, then what determined that significance? What made certain locations feel important to cultures that had no connection to Christianity? And is it possible that some of the architectural features found in later church buildings were not invented by Christian builders, but inherited from whatever tradition had occupied that site before? Not consciously, perhaps, or perhaps very consciously. The record from that earlier period is thin enough that it is difficult to say. Beneath some famous churches, excavations have revealed older structures. Roman temples in some cases, pre-Roman ritual spaces in others. In a few locations, the layers go deeper still, foundations beneath foundations, with the earliest levels corresponding to periods so distant that their original function has been largely lost. What were those original structures for? Why were those specific locations chosen again and again, across long stretches of time and across different cultures? The repetition of the sites is itself a kind of data point. When multiple unrelated civilizations identify the same location as significant, that consistency suggests something about the location itself, not just about the people who visited it. None of this leads to a clean conclusion. That is important to say clearly. Pointing out these patterns is not the same as explaining them, and explaining them is genuinely difficult because the evidence is incomplete. Records were lost. Structures were built over. The people who made the original decisions are long gone, and they did not always write down their reasons. So what we are left with is a collection of observable features, acoustic design, mathematical proportions, astronomical alignments, layered sacred sites, that each have partial explanations, but do not yet have full ones. And this is where the question becomes genuinely interesting rather than simply unusual, because the incomplete nature of the explanation is not the result of a lack of study. These buildings have been studied intensely. The incompleteness persists despite the study, which suggests either that the right questions haven't been asked consistently enough, or that the answers are located in sources and traditions that mainstream historical inquiry has not fully integrated. Some researchers believe both of those things are true simultaneously. Others are more cautious, but the disagreement itself is meaningful. Disagreement among serious researchers about well-studied subjects usually means the subject is more complex than the textbook version suggests. Consider the astronomical alignments found in certain church buildings. On specific dates, solstices, equinoxes, days of particular significance in the religious calendar, sunlight enters through windows or openings in the structure and falls on very specific points inside the building. An altar, a carved figure, a particular floor marker. These effects are not subtle. They are precise. The light travels a specific path and lands at a specific location, and this happens reliably, year after year, because the building was oriented and designed to produce exactly that result. Researchers who study these alignments have confirmed that achieving them requires detailed knowledge of solar movement, careful calculation, and deliberate architectural planning. But here is what makes this detail particularly interesting. In many cases, there is no surviving written record showing that the builders intended these alignments. The technical knowledge required to create them was clearly present. The effects themselves prove that. Yet the documentation of that knowledge, the notes, plans, or instructions that would confirm the intent, is missing. Some historians suggest the documentation simply did not survive. Documents from the medieval period were frequently lost to fire, flood, conflict, and deliberate destruction. That is a fair point, but it applies unevenly. Other kinds of medieval technical knowledge were documented and did survive. The specific absence of documentation around certain architecture to understand the questions surrounding church architecture. It helps to start with the explanation that most people already know. The accepted, mainstream account of how and why churches were built is not vague or poorly documented. It is actually one of the more thoroughly recorded stories in Western history. Historians have traced it across centuries. Theologians have interpreted it. Archaeologists have dug into the physical evidence. And what they collectively describe is a clear, logical progression, a story of a religious movement that grew, gained power, and built structures to match its expanding needs. That story is worth understanding fully before examining where it becomes complicated. The earliest Christians did not have dedicated buildings at all. This is a point that often surprises people, given how central church architecture has become to the Christian tradition. But in the first decades after the death of Jesus, the movement was small, informal, and frequently operating under conditions of suspicion or outright persecution. Gathering in large, visible structures would have been dangerous. So the earliest Christian communities met in private homes. These spaces were called house churches, and while the term sounds simple, they functioned as the complete center of early Christian life. Worship, teaching, community meals, and the administration of early sacraments all took place in ordinary domestic rooms. There was nothing architecturally distinctive about them. They looked like homes because they were homes. As the movement grew and conditions slowly changed, dedicated spaces began to appear. These were still modest, small rooms or buildings set aside specifically for religious gathering, but not yet the grand structures that most people associate with Christianity today. The architecture of this period was practical and unassuming. The priority was function, not form. Communities needed a space to gather. They found or built one. The theological ideas that would later drive the design of enormous cathedrals were not yet translated into stone. This raises an interesting point to hold in mind. The connection between religious belief and architectural expression did not develop all at once. It evolved, and the question of exactly how it evolved and why is more complex than the standard account suggests. The real turning point in Christian architecture came in the 4th century, and it came quickly. In the year 313, Emperor Constantine issued what became known as the Edict of Milan, a declaration that granted Christians the right to practice their religion freely throughout the Roman Empire. This was not simply a legal change. It was a transformation of the social and political position of Christianity, from a persecuted minority faith to a religion with imperial support and, eventually, imperial identity. The consequences for architecture were immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, Christian communities had access to resources, land, and political protection that had never been available before, and they used those resources to build. The structures that appeared during and after Constantine's reign drew heavily from existing Roman architectural traditions. This is a significant detail. The early church did not invent a new architectural language from scratch. It adapted one that already existed, specifically, the Roman basilica. A basilica was a type of large public building used in Roman cities for law courts, markets, and civic gatherings. It had a recognizable form, a long rectangular hall, typically divided by rows of columns, with a raised platform at one end where authority figures sat or stood. When Christian builders began constructing dedicated worship spaces, the basilica form provided a ready-made template. The long hall became the nave. The raised platform at the end became the apse, housing the altar. The structure that billions of people have entered as a place of worship began its life as a Roman civic building. This is entirely documented and not particularly controversial among historians, but it raises a question worth pausing on. If the foundational form of the Christian church building was borrowed from a secular Roman institution, a courthouse, essentially, then how much of what we assume to be religious design is actually civic design that was given religious meaning after the fact? The long nave that directs the eye toward the altar Is that a theological statement? Or is it simply the natural result of using a building type that was already designed to direct attention toward an authority at one end? This distinction might seem minor, but when you start pulling on that thread, it leads to some interesting places. The explanation for each major feature of church architecture follows a similar pattern. Take the height of the ceilings. In Gothic cathedrals, the ceilings can reach extraordinary heights, sometimes more than 40 meters above the floor. The standard explanation is theological. The upward movement of the space was intended to direct the mind and spirit toward the divine. Height represented transcendence. It was a physical metaphor for the relationship between humanity below and God above. That explanation is consistent with the theological writing of the period. Medieval theologians did write about architecture in these terms, so the connection between high ceilings and spiritual aspiration is not invented. It is documented. But here's where it becomes slightly unclear. Achieving those ceiling heights required engineering solutions that were, by any measure, extraordinary for the period. The development of the flying buttress, the external stone supports that allowed Gothic walls to be built taller and thinner than ever before, represents a genuine leap in structural engineering. Medieval builders did not have the mathematical tools that modern engineers use to calculate load distribution. They did not have material science as a discipline. They were working, according to the standard account, primarily through empirical experience and accumulated craft knowledge. And yet, the structural solutions they arrived at were not only successful but elegant, efficient in ways that modern analysis confirms were close to optimal. This doesn't disprove the theological explanation. The desire for height may well have been motivation, but motivation and execution are two different things. The desire to build higher is not the same as knowing how to build higher without the structure collapsing, and the knowledge required to execute those designs, to engineer flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and pointed arches that together allowed cathedrals to stand for centuries, is knowledge whose origin is not always fully traced in the historical record. Where did that engineering knowledge come from? How was it developed? And how was it transmitted from one building site to the next across different regions and generations? Stained glass windows provide another example of this pattern. The official explanation is educational and devotional. In a period when the majority of the population could not read, stained glass windows served as visual Bibles. Biblical scenes depicted in colored glass could communicate stories and theological ideas to people who had no access to written texts. The windows were, in this sense, a communication technology appropriate to the era. That explanation is reasonable and well supported by historical evidence. Church officials from the medieval period wrote about windows in exactly these terms. But the technical achievement represented by medieval stained glass goes considerably beyond what simple illustration would require. The color chemistry involved in producing the deep blues, reds, and golds found in the finest medieval windows was sophisticated in ways that are still studied today. Certain pigments and mineral compounds were used to achieve effects that later generations of glassmakers struggled to replicate, even with better tools and more advanced knowledge of chemistry. The famous blue of Chartres Cathedral, a color so distinctive that it is still studied and discussed by glass artists and historians, has not been definitively reproduced. The exact method used to achieve it is not fully understood. The windows that were supposed to serve as simple picture books for illiterate congregations were, at a technical level, more advanced than much of what came after them. At first, this seems like simply a testament to the skill of medieval craftsmen, and perhaps that is all it is. But it doesn't fully make sense when you consider the context. These were builders and craftsmen operating in an era before modern chemistry, before systematic material science, before any of the analytical tools we now use to understand how glass and pigment interact. How did they arrive at solutions that later, better-equipped generations found difficult to reproduce? What knowledge were they drawing on? And why is that knowledge so poorly documented in the surviving historical record? Bell towers are perhaps the most straightforwardly explained feature of church architecture. Their purpose is practical and clear. A large bell, hung high, produces a sound that can be heard across a significant distance, calling a community to worship at designated times. In an era before clocks were common, and before most people had personal timekeeping devices, The bell tower served an important civic function as much as a religious one. It organized communal time. It told people when to gather, when the day was beginning, when something significant was happening. The tower itself, beyond its acoustic function, also served as a visible landmark, a vertical marker that identified the presence of the church from a distance, in an era when the church was the central institution of community life. This explanation is complete and satisfying in a way that the explanations for acoustic design and astronomical alignment are not. But it raises its own small question. If the primary purpose of the tower was acoustic, getting the sound of a bell as far as possible, then the height of the tower needed to serve that purpose is considerably less than the heights actually built. Many church towers and cathedral spires extend far beyond what bell acoustics would require. The additional height served other purposes, presumably symbolic ones, primarily. The tower as a statement of the church's authority, its permanence, its reach toward the heavens. But when height goes beyond function into symbolism, the question of what exactly the symbolism meant, and to whom, becomes more open than it appears. The overall arc of church architectural history, as presented in textbooks, is a story of continuous development. Early basilicas gave way to Romanesque structures, with their thick walls and rounded arches. Romanesque gave way to Gothic, with its pointed arches and soaring heights. Gothic eventually gave way to the Renaissance, returned to classical proportions, and then to the ornamental richness of the Baroque period. Each transition is explained in terms of theological shifts, changing resources, evolving tastes, and the influence of key architectural thinkers. The story is coherent. It hangs together, and it is, in its broad outlines, accurate. But coherent stories can still have gaps, and the gaps in this particular story are not randomly distributed. They tend to cluster around the same kinds of features, the technical ones, the precise ones, the ones where the level of sophistication seems to exceed what the available tools and documented knowledge should have produced. Those gaps do not appear in the parts of the story that deal with religious motivation, institutional development, or the general direction of stylistic change. They appear specifically when the question is, how exactly did the builders know how to do this? And that specificity, the consistent location of the uncertainty in the technical details, rather than the general narrative, is worth noting. The official explanation of church architecture is logical, organized, and well supported by a substantial body of evidence. None of that is in question. What is worth examining more carefully is the boundary of that explanation, the edges where it becomes thinner, where the documentation becomes sparse, where the answers become vaguer, because at those edges, the buildings themselves continue to present features that the explanation has not yet fully absorbed. And those features are not decorative details. They are structural, they are precise, and they have been there, in plain sight, for centuries. Tural intentions, in building after building, is at minimum an unusual pattern. What all of this adds up to is not a single clear answer. It adds up to a set of questions that are more substantial than they first appear. The buildings we call churches are real. The history surrounding them is real. The religious purpose they served is real and well documented. None of that is being challenged here. What is being examined is something narrower, whether the buildings themselves contain dimensions of design and intention that the official history does not fully account for, whether certain features were included for reasons that went beyond worship as it is typically understood, whether knowledge was embedded in these structures that the builders understood but did not, or could not, explain in writing. Those questions do not have clean answers. The research is ongoing. The debates among scholars continue. And the buildings themselves continue to stand, solid, ancient, and still not fully explained, waiting for the questions to catch up with what they contain. The official explanation for church architecture is clear, organized, and supported by centuries of scholarship. It describes a logical progression, a religious movement that grew, gained resources, and built increasingly sophisticated structures to serve its expanding needs. That explanation covers a great deal of ground. It accounts for the general form of these buildings, the broad strokes of their design evolution, and the religious motivations that drove their construction. For most purposes and for most questions, it holds together reasonably well. But there is a category of question it does not hold together for. And that category involves the technical precision found inside these buildings. Not the general shape, not the overall purpose. The specific, measurable, engineered precision that shows up in the details. The kind of precision that requires not just motivation and labor, but knowledge. Specific, applied, sophisticated knowledge. And when you start asking where that knowledge came from, the explanation begins to show its first real cracks. The clearest place to see this is in the acoustic design of certain medieval church buildings. This is worth examining carefully because acoustics is a technical field. It deals with measurable physical phenomena, not interpretation or symbolism. Sound behaves according to consistent laws. Frequencies can be measured, resonance can be tested, and when researchers apply modern acoustic analysis to medieval cathedrals and older church structures, what they find is genuinely remarkable. These spaces do not simply sound large. They sound designed. The way sound moves through them, how it reflects, how it sustains, how it focuses in certain areas and disperses in others, shows a level of control that goes beyond what you would expect from builders working without any formal understanding of acoustic science. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what acoustic design actually involves. In modern architecture, achieving specific acoustic effects requires careful calculation. Architects work with acoustic engineers who use mathematical modeling to predict how sound will behave in a space before a single wall is built. They consider the shape of the room, the angles of the surfaces, the materials used, the height of the ceiling relative to the width of the floor. They run simulations. They test scale models. They make adjustments. And even with all of those tools, achieving a specific, controlled acoustic result is a complex and iterative process. It takes expertise, technology, and multiple rounds of refinement. Medieval builders had none of those tools. They had no mathematical models for sound behavior. They had no measurement instruments capable of capturing frequency data. They had no scientific framework for understanding why certain shapes produced certain acoustic effects. According to the accepted account, what they had was experience, generations of accumulated craft knowledge, passed from builder to builder, refined through practice over time. And the standard explanation holds that this experiential knowledge was sufficient to produce the acoustic results we observe today. At first, that explanation seems plausible. Skilled craftsmen do develop sophisticated intuitions through long practice. That is a real and well-documented phenomenon across many fields. But this is where the explanation runs into a specific problem. The problem is what trial and error actually requires. If medieval builders developed their acoustic knowledge through experimentation, through building, observing the results, and adjusting, then that process should have left evidence. It should have produced buildings that didn't work well acoustically, followed by buildings that work better, followed by the sophisticated results we see in the finest structures. The learning curve should be visible in the historical record, but in many cases it is not. Some of the acoustically most sophisticated church structures are among the oldest in their regional traditions. They appear not at the end of a long period of refinement, but near the beginning, as if the knowledge required to achieve those results was present from the start rather than gradually developed. This doesn't fit comfortably with the trial and error model. Trial and error produces improvement over time. It does not typically produce exceptional results in early examples before the learning process has had time to operate. This is where it becomes unclear. Not wrong necessarily. There are possible explanations. Regional knowledge could have been imported from other traditions. Builders from areas with longer architectural histories could have brought existing expertise to new regions. These are legitimate possibilities, and historians have explored them. But they shift the question rather than resolve it. If the knowledge was imported, where did it come from originally? What was its source? And why, in many cases, is the documentation of that transmission so thin? The knowledge clearly arrived somewhere. The buildings prove it. But the record of how it traveled, who carried it, from which tradition, and through what channel, is frequently incomplete. The acoustic effects themselves are worth describing in more detail, because they are not all of the same type. Some church buildings produce what acoustic researchers call whispering gallery effects. Sound spoken softly near one curved wall travels along the surface and can be heard clearly at a distant point, even across a large room. Other structures produce strong resonance at specific low frequencies, a quality that has a measurable physical effect on people present in the space, creating a sensation that some researchers describe as a kind of pressure or vibration felt as much as heard. Still, other buildings demonstrate unusual control of reverberation. Sound sustains for a controlled period and then fades in a way that feels almost deliberate, extending musical notes without blurring them into noise. Each of these effects requires different architectural conditions to achieve. Whispering gallery acoustics depend on specific curved geometries. Low-frequency resonance depends on the overall volume of the space and the properties of the enclosing materials. Controlled reverberation depends on the balance between hard reflective surfaces and softer absorptive ones, along with the proportions of the room. Achieving all of these effects simultaneously in a single building requires a level of integrated design thinking that goes well beyond instinct or simple experience. It requires understanding, even if that understanding is expressed through practice rather than written theory, of how these different acoustic factors interact. Some researchers have gone further in examining these effects and their potential purpose. The observation that low-frequency resonance in certain church spaces produces physical sensations in the people present, not just auditory experiences, but bodily ones, has led to questions about whether these effects were intentional and, if so, what they were intended to achieve. Some researchers have noted that the frequencies that resonate most strongly in certain historic church buildings correspond to ranges that are known to affect human physiology and psychology. Infrasound, sound at frequencies below the threshold of normal hearing, can produce feelings of unease, awe, or altered perception. Whether medieval builders understood this, and whether they built for it deliberately, is a question that remains genuinely open. The official response to these observations is cautious. Most mainstream historians are reluctant to attribute intentional psychological design to medieval church builders without direct documentary evidence of that intention. And that caution is reasonable. Making claims about intent requires evidence of intent, not just evidence of effect. The fact that a building produces a particular experience in its visitors does not automatically mean the builders planned for that experience. It could be coincidental. It could be a side effect of design choices made for other reasons. Maintaining that distinction between what a building does and what its builders intended is important for honest analysis. But this is where it doesn't fully make sense, because the consistency of these effects across many different buildings, built in different periods and different regions, makes coincidence increasingly difficult to accept as a complete explanation. One building with unusual acoustic properties could be coincidence. A dozen buildings across several countries, each demonstrating sophisticated and measurable acoustic control. That pattern asks for a different kind of explanation, and the honest answer is that the available evidence does not yet provide one that is fully satisfying. Beyond acoustics, other technical details raise similar questions. The structural engineering of Gothic cathedrals, specifically the development of the pointed arch and the flying buttress, represent solutions to structural problems that were, by any measure, sophisticated for their era. The pointed arch distributes load differently from the rounded Roman arch, allowing for taller, thinner walls. The flying buttress transfers the outward thrust of the roof and ceiling to external supports, freeing the interior walls from the structural role they had previously needed to play. Together, these innovations allowed medieval builders to create interior spaces of unprecedented height and lightness. What makes this interesting, from an analytical perspective, is that these solutions are close to optimal. Modern structural engineers, analyzing Gothic cathedrals with contemporary tools, find that the design choices made by medieval builders, working without calculus, without materials science, without computer modeling, produced results that are efficient and well-calibrated. Not perfect, but remarkably close to what a modern engineer with full knowledge of the relevant physics might design. This closeness to optimality is not what you typically expect from pure trial and error development. Trial and error tends to produce workable solutions, not near-optimal ones. Near-optimal results usually suggest a more systematic approach to problem-solving, one guided by knowledge or principles that go beyond simple experimentation. Where did that systematic approach come from? Some historians point to the role of master builders. highly skilled individuals who oversaw major construction projects and accumulated personal expertise over long careers. Others point to the medieval guilds, which preserved and transmitted craft knowledge across generations with notable consistency. These are real and important factors, but they still leave a gap between the knowledge those systems could plausibly have generated and the precision of the results they produced. The gap is not enormous. It is not so large that no explanation could bridge it, but it is consistent. It shows up in the acoustics, in the structural engineering, and, as will become clear, in other technical dimensions of these buildings as well. The important thing to hold onto at this point is that none of this disproves the standard explanation. The claim here is not that medieval builders couldn't have developed this knowledge through experience and transmission. The claim is narrower and more specific, that the standard explanation, as it stands, does not fully account for the level of technical achievement observable in these buildings. It describes the motivation, it describes the general process, but when pressed on the specific question of where the detailed, precise, applied knowledge came from, and how it was sufficient to produce results that challenge modern replication, the explanation becomes thinner. Not absent, thinner, and that thinness is the first real crack. Not a rupture, not a collapse, a crack, the kind that, once noticed, is difficult to stop examining, because behind it there are more questions, and some of them are considerably harder to answer than this one. To understand why the questions surrounding church architecture matter, it helps to step back from the buildings themselves for a moment. It helps to look at what was happening before they were built, because the story of church architecture does not begin with Christianity. It begins much earlier, and that earlier beginning, the period before the first Christian stone was laid, contains details that the standard account of church history tends to move past quickly. Details that, when examined more carefully, raise questions about what these buildings were actually inheriting when they rose from the ground. The starting point is a fact that is openly acknowledged by historians and is not remotely controversial. Many of the sites where famous church buildings now stand were considered sacred long before Christianity arrived in those regions. This is not a fringe claim. It is documented in mainstream historical and archaeological literature. The locations that became home to some of the most celebrated churches in Europe, the Middle East, and beyond were not empty plots of land chosen for practical convenience. They were places that already carried meaning, places that communities had already identified, over long periods of time, as significant, as different, as worthy of particular attention and reverence. This pattern is widespread enough to be called consistent. In Britain, major churches and cathedrals frequently occupy sites with pre-Christian histories. In France, the same pattern holds. In Spain, in Germany, in Italy, in regions across the former Roman Empire and beyond, the locations of significant Christian structures often sit on top of, or directly beside, evidence of earlier sacred use. Roman temples, Celtic shrines, prehistoric ritual enclosures. The layers go down, and in many cases, they go down further than casual historical accounts suggest. This raises a question that is easy to overlook. What made these locations feel significant in the first place? And was that original significance simply symbolic? Or was there something about the physical location itself that drew human attention across multiple cultures and long stretches of time? The explanation offered by mainstream historians for why Christian builders chose these sites is practical and well documented. It was a deliberate strategy of religious conversion. If a community already gathered at a particular place to perform rituals and mark important occasions, then establishing a Christian presence at that same location was an efficient way of redirecting that existing spiritual habit toward the new faith. You did not need to convince people to travel to a new place. You simply needed to change what they did when they arrived at the familiar one. The location stayed the same. The meaning was reframed. This strategy was not informal or accidental. It was explicitly discussed and recommended by early church leadership. One of the clearest examples is a letter written in the 6th century by Pope Gregory I to a missionary working in Britain. In that letter, Gregory advised against destroying the existing sacred sites of the local population. Instead, he recommended converting them, transforming the spaces and the rituals associated with them into Christian ones. Keep the festivals, he suggested, but redirect them toward Christian occasions. Keep the places, but fill them with Christian meaning. This was pragmatic advice, and it worked. The strategy helped Christianity spread into communities that might otherwise have resisted more aggressive approaches to conversion. But here is where a small and important doubt enters. If the sites were chosen because they already held significance for local populations, significance rooted in older traditions that predated Christianity by centuries or sometimes millennia, then what was the source of that original significance? The practical explanation for why church builders chose those sites does not explain why those sites were sacred in the first place. It explains the Christian decision to use them. It does not explain the pre-Christian reason. They were already there. And that earlier reason is the part of the story that tends to receive the least attention. In some cases, the pre-Christian use of these sites is relatively well understood. A Roman temple occupied the location. Roman religious practices are documented. The temple's dedication, its rituals, its architectural form, these can often be reconstructed with reasonable confidence from surviving sources. When a church is built on the site of a Roman temple, there is at least a documented chain of use, even if questions remain about why the Romans chose that particular spot. But in other cases, the pre-Roman layer is far less clear. Beneath the Roman structures, archaeologists sometimes find evidence of use that predates the Roman period by centuries. And at that level, the documentation becomes very thin. The purposes of these earlier structures are frequently uncertain. Their builders left no written records. What survives is physical, stone, arrangement, orientation, and interpreting that physical evidence requires inference rather than direct knowledge. This is where it becomes genuinely unclear, because interpretation of physical evidence without accompanying written records is always uncertain. And yet the physical evidence is often quite specific. Some of the pre-Roman structures found beneath or near famous church sites are not random arrangements of stone. They show clear signs of intentional design, careful orientation toward specific points on the horizon, geometric relationships between elements that suggest planning rather than accident. In some cases, alignments with astronomical events, sunrise or sunset on particular dates, the position of specific stars at specific times of year. These features indicate that whoever built the original structures was working with a coherent system of knowledge. But what that system was, and where it came from, is not fully understood. The excavations beneath some of Europe's most famous churches have produced findings that are striking in their implications. Beneath the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, archaeologists have found evidence of a Gallo-Roman temple, and beneath that, traces of even earlier activity. Beneath Canterbury Cathedral in England, pre-Roman deposits have been identified. Beneath the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Roman-era structures, and, deeper still, evidence of earlier occupation. Beneath churches across Ireland, evidence of Celtic ritual use going back to the Iron Age and beyond. In each case, the Christian structure represents the most recent layer of a long sequence of sacred use at the same location. And in each case, the reasons for the original choice of that location, the very first reason, the one that started the sequence, are the least documented and the least examined. One possible interpretation of this pattern is purely sociological. People tend to continue using places that already carry meaning for a community. Sacred sites accumulate history the way rivers accumulate sediment, layer by layer, each new layer resting on what came before. On this reading, the pattern of layered sacred sites simply reflects the human tendency to respect and reuse places of established significance. There's nothing mysterious about it. It is just how communities work. That interpretation is reasonable, but it pushes the question back without resolving it. Even if later communities were simply following the lead of earlier ones, someone had to be the first. Someone, some early community, working with whatever knowledge and perception they had, chose a particular location and identified it as significant. What were they responding to? What did they notice about that place that made it feel different from the surrounding landscape? Were they responding to something visible and practical, a reliable water source, a natural shelter, a defensible position? Or were they responding to something less tangible, a quality of the place itself that their senses or their practices led them to perceive. Some researchers have explored the possibility that certain locations have measurable physical properties that distinguish them from the surrounding landscape. Variations in the local magnetic field, geological features that affect the behavior of groundwater or produce unusual electromagnetic conditions, the presence of specific rock types that have distinctive physical properties. These are not supernatural claims. They are physical ones, questions about whether there is something measurable about the places that became sacred sites that might have drawn consistent human attention across different cultures and long periods of time. The research in this area is not conclusive, but it exists, and it involves serious researchers asking serious questions. What makes this relevant to the question of church architecture is the possibility, and it is only a possibility, that the inherited significance of these sites was not purely symbolic. That when Christian builders chose to construct their structures on pre-existing sacred locations, they were not only inheriting a social and cultural meaning, but also, in some cases, a physical one. And if that physical meaning influenced the original choice of location, it may also have influenced the architectural decisions made at those sites, the orientation of the building, the placement of specific chambers, the design of features that we currently struggle to explain in purely religious terms. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because following this line of inquiry requires working with evidence that is fragmentary, interpretations that are contested, and questions that mainstream historical scholarship has not yet fully engaged with. The thinness of the records from the pre-Christian period at these sites is real. It is not fabricated or exaggerated. It is a genuine feature of the historical landscape, and that thinness cuts both ways. It means we cannot confirm that the original choice of these sites was based on anything beyond social and cultural factors, but it also means we cannot rule out that it was based on something more. The evidence is simply not complete enough to settle the question either way. And this incompleteness matters, because the sites are where the buildings stand. The buildings are where the unexplained features appear. And the unexplained features, the acoustic precision, the astronomical alignments, the mathematical proportions, are the reason this investigation began. If the sites themselves carry a history that is not fully understood, and if that history may have influenced the design of the structures built on them, then the questions about those features become deeper than they first appeared. They are not just questions about medieval engineering knowledge. They are questions about a chain of inheritance, a sequence of choices made at the same locations, across very long stretches of time, by people who may have been responding to the same underlying conditions in ways that we have not yet fully learned to recognize or read. The records from the earliest period are thin. That thinness is not an accident of historical preservation alone. In some cases, it reflects active choices, decisions made by later authorities about what to record, what to preserve, and what to allow to fade. What faded may have included precisely the knowledge most relevant to understanding why these locations were chosen, and what the builders who worked there actually knew. And what faded cannot simply be reconstructed from what survived. It has to be approached differently, through the buildings themselves, through the physical evidence still present in the ground beneath them, and through the patterns that emerge when you look at enough of them together. That approach is slower. It is less certain, but it may be the only way to reach the parts of this story that the standard account has not yet found. When researchers begin comparing church buildings across different countries and different centuries, something unexpected starts to emerge. Not immediately, not from a single comparison, but gradually, as the data accumulates, a pattern becomes visible that is difficult to explain through the standard framework of independent regional development. Buildings that should have nothing in common, constructed by different cultures, in different languages, guided by different local traditions, with no documented communication between their builders, begin to show similarities that go beyond coincidence. Not surface similarities, not the general resemblance that comes from sharing the same broad religious tradition. Something more specific, more precise, more resistant to easy explanation. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what independent development normally looks like. When two separate cultures, with no contact between them, develop solutions to similar problems, those solutions tend to share broad functional characteristics, but differ in their specific details. The general approach converges because the problem is the same. The precise implementation diverges because the knowledge bases are separate. This is a well-established pattern in the history of technology and architecture. Cultures that independently develop writing systems produce systems that serve the same communicative function but differ enormously in their specific forms. Cultures that independently develop agricultural techniques produce methods that share general principles but vary in their particular application. Independent development produces functional similarity with detailed divergence. What appears in church architecture, by contrast, is something closer to functional similarity with detailed convergence. And that is the opposite of what independent development should produce. The most direct place to see this is in the floor plans. When architectural researchers measure and compare the ground-level layouts of church buildings across Europe, and in some cases beyond Europe, they find that the proportions repeat with a consistency that is hard to account for through separate invention. The ratio of the nave's length to its width, the distance from the entrance to the point where the transept crosses, the relationship between the width of the central nave and the width of the side aisles. These specific numerical relationships appear again and again in buildings separated not only by geography but by centuries. A church built in northern England in the 11th century shares precise dimensional ratios with a church built in southern France in the 13th century. Both share those same ratios with churches from other regions and other periods. The repetition is not approximate. It is specific, and specific repetition across independent examples is exactly what needs explaining. The first and most natural explanation offered by historians is theological symbolism. The cross-shaped floor plan of many churches, the long nave crossed by the shorter transept, obviously represents the Christian cross. This is straightforward symbolism, clearly intentional, and well documented in theological writing from the periods when these buildings were constructed. Church builders did not hide the fact that the cruciform plan carried religious meaning. They wrote about it, preached about it, and considered it an important expression of Christian faith rendered in architectural form. So when similar floor plans appear in churches across different regions, the simplest explanation is shared theological intention. Same religion, same symbolism, same shape. That explanation works for the general form. A cross is a cross. You don't need precision to communicate that symbolism. A rough approximation, any shape that suggests the intersection of two perpendicular lines, carries the same basic meaning. A congregation entering a church shaped loosely, like a cross, receives the same symbolic message as a congregation entering one shaped with mathematical exactness. The symbol does not require the precision, and this is where the explanation starts to weaken, because the precision exists regardless. The specific mathematical ratios found in these floor plans go well beyond what symbolism alone would require or explain. You can express a cross in architecture without adhering to specific geometric proportions. The fact that specific proportions were consistently maintained across buildings where their maintenance required significant additional effort and planning suggests that those proportions were valued for a reason beyond symbolism. But what that reason was is not clearly documented. Some architectural historians and researchers have identified the specific proportional systems used in these buildings and traced them to older mathematical traditions. Ratios derived from classical Greek geometry. Proportional systems described in ancient texts on architecture and harmony. Relationships between numbers that appear in earlier traditions of sacred geometry. A body of mathematical knowledge that treated certain proportions as having significance beyond their practical applications. These connections are real and have been documented by serious scholars. The question they raise is not whether these proportional systems existed, but how they traveled from their apparent origins into the hands of medieval Christian builders working across a wide geographic area, and why their application was consistent enough to produce the cross-building comparisons researchers observe today. This is where the guilds enter the picture. Medieval building guilds, organized associations of skilled craftsmen, who manage the transmission of construction knowledge across generations, are one of the most frequently cited explanations for the consistency of architectural knowledge across medieval Europe. These guilds were real. They were powerful. They controlled access to certain types of building knowledge, trained apprentices through structured programs, and maintained relationships between master builders across long distances. The influence of guild knowledge on the consistency of medieval architecture is documented and undeniable. When a guild trained builders in a particular proportional system, and those builders went on to work at sites across a wide region, the resulting buildings would naturally share characteristics rooted in that shared training. This is a logical and well-supported explanation, but it doesn't account for all the cases. And the cases it doesn't account for are specifically the ones that are most interesting. The guild system, as a well-organized institution, belongs to a particular period of medieval history. The most influential guilds reached their peak of organization and geographic reach in the High Medieval period, roughly the 12th through 15th centuries. But the proportional similarities in church architecture appear in buildings that predate this period. Some of the most striking examples of precise proportional consistency are found in structures built before the guild system reached the organizational level required to transmit that kind of specific knowledge across large distances. If the guilds explain the later consistency, something else needs to explain the earlier one. And there's a second problem with the guild explanation, one that is perhaps more revealing. The historical record indicates that guild knowledge, particularly the knowledge related to the specific mathematical principles used in sacred architecture, was not simply a body of practical craft technique. It was treated as something that needed to be protected, guarded, transmitted selectively, only to those who had passed through specific stages of initiation and demonstrated trustworthiness. The oaths taken by guild members regarding the secrecy of certain knowledge are documented. The hierarchical structure of knowledge within the guilds, where different levels of membership had access to different levels of information, is documented. This was not simply professional protectionism of the kind that might apply to any trade secret. The level of secrecy involved, and the specific nature of the knowledge being protected, suggests that something more significant was at stake. This raises a question that is worth sitting with. Why would mathematical proportions used in building construction need to be kept secret? Practical craft techniques are sometimes kept within guilds for competitive reasons. A guild that controls exclusive knowledge has economic advantages. But the proportional systems used in church architecture were not purely commercial tools. They were applied in buildings commissioned and overseen by powerful religious and secular authorities. The church itself was the primary client of medieval builders. Why would the church permit or tolerate a situation where the specific knowledge underlying the design of its own buildings was held in secret by the builders, accessible only to those within a protected hierarchy? And if the church did know the full content of that knowledge, why did it not document it more openly? These questions don't have satisfying answers in the standard account. Some researchers have suggested that the knowledge being protected was not simply technical, that alongside the practical mathematical systems used to design buildings, the guilds preserved older ideas, philosophical, cosmological, or spiritual in nature, about the significance of those mathematical relationships, ideas that may not have been fully compatible with official church theology, or that came from sources the church would have found problematic to acknowledge openly. On this reading, the secrecy was not primarily about professional competition. It was about the nature of the knowledge itself, knowledge that drew from traditions older than Christianity, packaged and transmitted through the structure of the guilds in a form that could survive without drawing unwanted official attention. This interpretation is contested. Not all historians accept it, and it is fair to say that the evidence for it is suggestive rather than conclusive. There is a category of evidence related to church buildings that tends to receive less attention than the acoustic properties or the proportional systems. It is mentioned occasionally in architectural histories. It appears in research papers from time to time. But in the broader public conversation about these buildings, the documentaries, the guidebooks, the educational materials, it tends to be handled briefly, acknowledged in passing, and then moved away from without much examination. That category is astronomical alignment, and the more carefully you look at it, the more difficult it becomes to set aside. The basic phenomenon is this. A significant number of historic church buildings, not a handful, not a minor exception, but a substantial and well-documented group, are oriented in ways that produce specific light effects on specific dates in the calendar. The building is positioned so that on a particular day of the year, sunlight entering through a window, a doorway, or an opening in the structure travels along a precise path and lands on a precise point inside the building. An altar, a carved figure, a floor marker, a specific stone. The effect is not general or approximate. It is exact. The light arrives at a particular location, at a particular time of day, on a particular date. And then, for the rest of the year, it does not. The alignment is specific to that moment, and it works because the building was designed to make it work. To appreciate why this is significant, it helps to think about what producing such an effect actually requires. It is not a simple matter. Achieving a precise solar alignment in a building is not something that happens by accident, and it is not something that results from rough approximation. It requires knowing, before construction begins, exactly where the sun will be in the sky on the target date, at the target time of day. It requires knowing how light entering from a specific direction will travel through an interior space. It requires designing the building's orientation, its window placement, and its interior geometry in a coordinated way, so that all of these factors combine to produce the desired result. And it requires executing that design with sufficient precision that the effect, when the target date arrives, actually occurs. This is not a simple chain of requirements. It involves knowledge of solar astronomy, the sun's movement through the year, its changing angle of elevation at different seasons, its precise position on the horizon at sunrise and sunset on specific dates. It involves geometric planning of a kind that has to happen before construction, not during it. And it involves a level of measurement accuracy that is easy to underestimate. A small error in the orientation of the building, or in the placement of a window, can shift the landing point of a solar beam by enough to miss the intended target entirely. The margin for error in achieving these effects is narrow, which means the knowledge and precision required to achieve them is substantial. When researchers identify these alignments in medieval church buildings, the responses from mainstream scholarship tend to fall into one of two categories. The first is coincidence. The alignment, it is suggested, may simply be accidental, a byproduct of choices made for other reasons that happen to produce a solar effect. The second is symbolic intent. The builders, it is suggested, may have been aware of the natural cycle of the sun and chose to acknowledge it symbolically by orienting their building in a way that connected it to significant dates in the Christian calendar: Christmas, Easter, the solstices as they relate to the feast days of particular saints. Both of these responses have some validity. Coincidence cannot be ruled out in any individual case. A single alignment in a single building might plausibly be accidental. And symbolic intent is a legitimate explanation, one that is consistent with how medieval Christians thought about the relationship between natural cycles and religious observance. The church calendar was closely tied to the movements of the sun and moon. Feast days were scheduled with astronomical awareness, so the idea that builders oriented their structures to acknowledge those astronomical events in physical form is not unreasonable. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the coincidence argument weakens considerably when you move from individual buildings to the broader pattern. The number of historic church buildings with documented solar alignments is large. Researchers studying this phenomenon have identified examples across Britain, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and beyond. They have found alignments connected to the winter solstice, the summer solstice, the spring and autumn equinoxes, and to dates specifically significant in the Christian liturgical calendar. The alignments are not randomly distributed across dates. They cluster around moments of astronomical significance. And when a pattern clusters consistently rather than appearing randomly, coincidence becomes an increasingly inadequate explanation. The symbolic intent argument also has limits, and those limits become visible when you look at the technical demands of what was actually built. If a medieval builder wanted to symbolically acknowledge the winter solstice, they had many options available. They could have included references to the solstice in carvings, in painted decoration, in the liturgical texts used on that day, in the timing of specific ceremonies. All of these would have communicated the symbolic connection without requiring the builder to engineer a precise solar alignment into the physical structure of the building. The fact that the alignment was built in, that the building itself was oriented and designed so that the sun's light would physically mark the occasion, goes beyond what simple symbolism would require. It suggests a different kind of intention, not just the acknowledgement of an astronomical event, but the deliberate capture of it, the deliberate channeling of solar light to a specific point at a specific moment. And this is where the most puzzling aspect of these alignments comes into focus. In many of the buildings where precise solar alignments have been documented, there's no surviving written record showing that the builders intended those alignments. This is the gap that is genuinely difficult to explain. The effect is there. The precision of the effect demonstrates planning. Planning requires intention, but the intention left no trace in the documentary record that survives. No design notes, no astronomical calculations, no instructions from the supervising authority specifying where the sun should fall and on what date. The building contains the evidence of sophisticated prior thought. The archives do not. One possible explanation for this gap is simple documentary loss. Records from the medieval period survive imperfectly. Fire, flood, war, deliberate destruction, and the general fragility of pre-modern record-keeping have eliminated enormous quantities of historical documentation. It is entirely possible that the records of the astronomical planning behind these alignments once existed and no longer do. This is a fair point and should not be dismissed. Absence of evidence in the historical record is not always evidence of absence in reality. But this explanation, while reasonable, is uneven in its application. Other aspects of medieval church construction are documented in considerable detail. Contracts between builders and patrons survive. Records of materials purchased, wages paid, and construction timelines have come down to us from many major building projects. The financial and logistical dimensions of medieval church construction left substantial paper trails in many cases. So the idea that the documentary record could preserve detailed accounts of a building's finances while completely losing any trace of its astronomical design is possible but asymmetric. It requires the loss to have been selective in a particular way, preserving the mundane and eliminating specifically the astronomical. That pattern of loss is not impossible, but it is worth noting as unusual. Some researchers have approached this gap from a different direction. Rather than assuming the records existed and were lost, they have considered the possibility that the astronomical knowledge embedded in these buildings was intentionally not written down in accessible form, that it was transmitted through practical demonstration, through the act of designing and building, passed from one generation of builders to the next through the physical process of doing the work rather than through written instruction. This model of knowledge transmission is not unique to architecture. Many technical traditions, across many cultures, have operated through embodied practice rather than written documentation. The knowledge lives in the hands and eyes of the practitioner, not on the page. If this is how the astronomical knowledge used in church architecture was transmitted, then the absence of written records is not a gap caused by loss. It is a feature of how the knowledge worked. And that possibility raises a further question. Why would knowledge of this kind be transmitted in that way? Written documentation is generally more reliable than oral or practical transmission over long periods of time. If the astronomical alignments in these buildings were simply symbolic acknowledgments of the church calendar, there would be no obvious reason to avoid writing them down. The fact that they may not have been written down intentionally suggests that something about the nature of this knowledge made written documentation either unnecessary or inadvisable. There are specific buildings where the solar alignments are particularly striking and have been studied in considerable detail. Several churches in Ireland demonstrate precise alignments with the winter solstice sunrise, a date that was clearly significant in the pre-Christian traditions of that region long before Christianity arrived there. Churches in southern France show equinoctial alignments of a kind that researchers have connected to older astronomical traditions in the Mediterranean world. In Spain, several churches built on or near sites sacred to earlier cultures display orientations that do not align with the feast day of their official patron saint, but do align with astronomically significant dates that were important in pre-Roman indigenous traditions. These are not random connections. They suggest that in some cases, the astronomical alignments in Christian church buildings reflect knowledge and intentions inherited from the pre-Christian traditions of the sites on which they stand, not invented by the Christian builders, but received from what came before. This does not mean that the Christian builders were secretly practicing pre-Christian religion. It is more subtle than that. It suggests that certain kinds of knowledge, about the significance of specific dates, about the way solar light could be used to mark those dates in a physical space, about why certain locations were oriented in particular ways, survived the transition from one religious tradition to another, not necessarily as explicit theology, perhaps as embedded practice, as the accumulated wisdom of builders who had worked at these sites across generations, absorbing what had been done there before and incorporating it into what they were doing now, without necessarily articulating why. The gap between what was built and what was recorded remains. It has not been closed by any explanation currently available in the mainstream account of church architecture. The alignments exist. Their precision demonstrates planning. Their documentation does not, and the pattern of their occurrence, clustered around astronomically significant dates, connected to pre-Christian traditions, present across buildings in multiple countries and centuries, continues to raise questions that a brief acknowledgement of symbolic intent does not fully resolve. The evidence is there, built into the stones themselves. What it means is still, in important ways, an open question. At a certain point in any investigation, individual observations stop being individual. They start connecting. They start forming a shape. And when that shape appears consistently, when the same cluster of features shows up in the same combination across different countries, different centuries, and different building traditions, it stops being a collection of separate anomalies and starts being a pattern. Patterns are not proof of anything by themselves, but they are the kind of evidence that demands a response. And the pattern that emerges when you look at historic church buildings across a wide geographic and historical range is one that the standard explanations have not yet fully responded to. The individual elements of this pattern have been examined separately in earlier parts of this investigation. Advanced acoustic properties, with no surviving documentation of acoustic planning. Precise solar alignments with no written record of astronomical intent. Mathematical proportions shared across buildings that have no documented connection to each other. Sacred sites built over older sacred sites, with the earlier layers rarely examined in full. Each of these, taken alone, can be partially explained. Each has a response in the mainstream historical account, even if that response is incomplete. But when these features appear together, not in one building, not in a few buildings, but consistently across a wide range of structures from England to France, from Spain to Germany, from Egypt to Ethiopia, the partial explanations start to feel less adequate, because the question is no longer why any single building has these features. The question becomes why all of these buildings do. England provides some of the clearest examples. Many of the older churches in the English countryside, not just the famous cathedrals, but modest parish churches in small towns, sit on sites with pre-Christian histories. A significant number demonstrate acoustic properties that researchers have noted as unusual. Some show solar alignments connected to dates in the pre-Christian calendar of the British Isles, and when their proportions are measured carefully, familiar ratios appear. These are not spectacular buildings. They are ordinary ones. And that is precisely what makes them significant. If these features appeared only in the great prestige projects, the cathedrals funded by kings and bishops, you could attribute them to exceptional resources and exceptional builders. But when they appear in ordinary buildings, built by ordinary communities with modest means, the question of where the knowledge came from becomes much harder to answer with the standard explanations. France presents a similar picture, but with additional layers. Several churches in the south of France, a region with a particularly complex religious history, marked by the presence of multiple traditions both before and during the Christian period, show alignments and proportional systems that researchers have connected to older Mediterranean mathematical and astronomical traditions. Some of these connections have been traced through the historical record in ways that are at least partially documented. Others are inferred from the physical evidence of the buildings themselves, without clear written confirmation. What makes France particularly interesting is the density of the pattern, the number of buildings in a relatively compact area that share these features, and the way that density correlates with regions known for intense contact between different knowledge traditions in the medieval period. Spain adds another dimension. Several Spanish churches, particularly in regions where Christian, Islamic, and Jewish communities coexisted during the medieval period, show architectural features that draw from more than one tradition. This cultural blending is acknowledged by historians and is not particularly controversial. What is less discussed is the degree to which certain technical features, specific proportional systems, certain acoustic qualities, particular orientations, appear in buildings from all three of these traditions, as if the knowledge underlying those features was not specific to any one religion, but was shared across the boundaries between them. If that knowledge crossed religious lines, then its origin cannot be attributed to any single theological tradition. It must come from somewhere older, and what that older source was is not clearly identified in the standard account. Germany and the broader Central European region contribute examples that are particularly notable for their architectural precision. A number of Romanesque churches in Germany, built in the 11th and 12th centuries, before Gothic architecture fully took hold in the region, show proportional systems of considerable mathematical sophistication. Researchers who have analyzed these buildings in detail have found that the specific ratios used in their design correspond to systems described in ancient texts that were not widely circulated in the Christian scholarly world of the period, and whose influence on building construction is not well documented. How those systems made their way into the hands of builders working in 11th century Germany is a question that does not have a fully satisfying answer in the current historical record. Egypt and Ethiopia introduce a geographical dimension that complicates the pattern further. Ancient Christian communities in both of these countries produced church buildings with features that parallel those found in European examples, specific orientations, underground spaces of uncertain purpose, proportional systems that share characteristics with those used thousands of miles away. The Coptic Christian tradition in Egypt and the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition represent very early branches of Christianity, developing in relative isolation from the European Church for significant periods. The fact that similar unexplained features appear in their sacred buildings suggests that whatever knowledge underlies these features is not specific to the European branch of Christianity. It is something that appears wherever Christianity took root in communities with deep pre-existing sacred traditions, as if certain building practices were absorbed into Christian architecture from the underlying cultures, regardless of which specific culture that was. But this is where it becomes unclear, because at a certain point, the geographic range of the pattern starts to exceed what any single transmission route could plausibly explain. The guild system could account for consistency within Europe. Cultural contact during the medieval period could explain some cross-regional similarities. But when the same cluster of features appears in Ethiopian churches built in relative isolation from European influence, and in Coptic Egyptian churches with their own distinct architectural tradition, a single transmission route seems inadequate. Either the knowledge was extremely ancient and widely distributed before Christianity existed, or it was repeatedly rediscovered through independent processes that converged on the same results, or something else is happening that the current explanatory framework doesn't fully capture. None of these options is simple. None of them is fully supported by the available evidence, and all of them remain genuinely open. Now, there's one feature of this broader pattern that tends to receive even less attention than the acoustics and the alignments. It is perhaps the most physically tangible of all the unexplained elements, and in some ways the most directly puzzling. That feature is what lies beneath the main floor of many historic church buildings, not the well-documented crypts, but the spaces that sometimes lie below even those. Crypts are a well-understood feature of church architecture. They served as burial spaces for important individuals, bishops, abbots, local rulers, prominent members of the community. Their presence is documented, their purpose is clear, and their architectural form is generally well understood. Many famous churches have crypts that are open to visitors, that have been archaeologically examined, and whose history is reasonably well established. The existence of crypts is not mysterious, but in a number of cases, researchers examining crypts in historic churches have found evidence of spaces that predate the crypt itself, older chambers sealed off, not integrated into the functional layout of the building above, and not clearly connected to the burial purpose that explains the crypt. These older subcrypt spaces vary considerably in their form and contents. Some are simple voids, empty chambers cut into the rock or earth beneath the building, with no obvious indication of their original use. Some contain architectural features, carved walls, shaped niches, patterned floors that suggest deliberate design rather than simple excavation. And some contain markings, not Christian iconography, not crosses or biblical imagery, or the symbols associated with Christian devotion. Something different: geometric forms, spiral patterns, configurations of lines and angles that appear in similar forms in very different contexts. On ancient standing stones in the British Isles, in pre-Roman ritual sites across Europe, in certain mathematical manuscripts from traditions far removed from medieval Christianity. At first, it seems normal to attribute these markings to pre-Christian use of the site. If the church was built on a location that was previously used for non-Christian ritual, then chambers beneath the church might preserve physical traces of that earlier use. That is a reasonable interpretation, and in some cases, it is probably the correct one. But it doesn't fully make sense as a complete explanation for all cases, because in some instances, the subcrypt chambers appear to have been constructed at the same time as the church above them, not simply inherited from an earlier period. The construction technique matches the period of the church. The materials are consistent, which means the builders of the church, in at least some cases, were not simply leaving pre-existing chambers in place. They were creating new ones, and they were marking those new chambers with symbols that did not belong to the Christian tradition they were ostensibly building for. Why would they do this? This raises questions that are genuinely difficult to answer. One possibility is that certain builders, particularly those operating within the protected knowledge systems of the guilds, were maintaining practices and marking systems that connected to older traditions, embedding them in the foundations of new buildings as a way of preserving something they considered important. Another possibility is that these spaces served functional purposes that the builders did not record, purposes related to whatever technical or knowledge-based activities the subsurface chambers were used for. A third possibility is that the symbols in these spaces were not intended to communicate anything to later observers, but served a purpose within the building process itself. Markers used in construction, perhaps, or orientations used for alignment purposes, that happen to resemble symbols from other traditions because both drew from the same underlying geometric logic. None of these explanations is fully confirmed. None can be, given the current state of the evidence. What can be said is that the markings exist, that they appear in multiple locations, that they share characteristics across buildings and traditions that are not supposed to be connected, and that no explanation currently in the mainstream account fully addresses why they are there or what they mean. The geometric forms found in these subsurface chambers appear in pre-Christian megalithic sites. They appear in ancient Mediterranean mathematical traditions. They appear in manuscripts from medieval scholarly communities that operated at the edges of official religious orthodoxy. The connection spanned enormous distances in time and geography, and yet the connections are specific enough, the same forms, the same configurations, that they resist being dismissed as coincidence. The pattern, taken as a whole, is now visible in its full shape. Advanced acoustic design without documented acoustic knowledge, solar alignments without documented astronomical intent, mathematical proportions without documented connection between the buildings that share them, layered sacred sites with the lower layers inadequately examined, underground spaces with markings that cross the boundaries between traditions. Each element appears separately. Each element appears together with the others, consistently, across a wide geographic and historical range. The repetition is real. The pattern is real. What it means, what single explanation or combination of explanations could account for all of it, remains, at this point, genuinely unclear. And that unclarity is not for lack of looking. It persists despite the looking, which suggests that whatever is being looked for may require a different kind of looking to find. There is a natural tendency, when investigating unusual features in historic buildings, to focus on the famous ones. The great cathedrals draw attention because they are large, well-documented, and widely studied. They are the buildings most likely to appear in research papers, in architectural histories, in documentary films. If you are looking for examples of unusual acoustic properties, or precise solar alignments, or sophisticated mathematical proportions, the famous cathedrals are the obvious starting point. They have been measured, analyzed, and written about in considerable detail. The data is available. The examples are clear. and so the investigation naturally gravitates toward them. But this creates a subtle bias in how the problem is perceived. When unusual features appear only in the most famous and heavily resourced buildings, there's always a ready explanation available. Exceptional projects attract exceptional builders. Exceptional builders have access to exceptional knowledge, and exceptional knowledge produces exceptional results. On this reading, the unusual features of the great cathedrals are simply the byproduct of having the best builders working on the most important projects with the most generous budgets. The knowledge required to produce those features was rare and expensive, concentrated in the hands of a small number of highly skilled specialists, available only to the patrons wealthy enough to hire them. The cathedrals are unusual because they were exceptional projects. Simple as that. That explanation is comfortable. It is also, when examined carefully, incomplete, because the patterns under investigation do not confine themselves to the famous buildings. When researchers expand their search beyond the celebrated cathedrals to include smaller, less prominent structures, regional churches, modest chapels, ordinary parish buildings in rural areas, and small towns, they find the same features. Not always, not in every building, but with a consistency that goes well beyond what the exceptional resources explanation can account for. The precision is there. The alignments are there. The mathematical proportions are there. The layered sacred sites are there. And in many cases, these features appear in buildings where the resources available were modest. The builders were local rather than internationally recruited specialists, and the project was too small and too ordinary to have attracted the kind of elite architectural talent that the great cathedrals could command. This changes the nature of the question significantly. If the knowledge required to produce these features was rare and concentrated at the top of the medieval building hierarchy, accessible only to the most skilled and most expensive specialists, then it should not appear consistently in modest local buildings. Its presence in those buildings suggests something different about how that knowledge was distributed, not concentrated in a small elite, but spread more broadly through the building community, available not only to the masters of the great cathedrals, but to the builders of ordinary parish churches, carried not just by the most celebrated architects of the period, but by craftsmen working at a much more local and less prestigious scale. And this is where it becomes unclear, because if the knowledge was that widely distributed, if it was present not only at the top of the building hierarchy but throughout it, then it must have been transmitted through a very effective and systematic system. Widely distributed knowledge does not maintain its consistency accidentally. It does not appear in the same specific form across hundreds of buildings, in dozens of regions, over multiple centuries, unless there is a structured mechanism for passing it from one practitioner to the next, something organized enough to maintain the specific details, the precise ratios, the specific orientation methods, the acoustic principles, across long distances of time and geography without allowing them to drift or dilute into approximations. The guild system is the most commonly cited candidate for this transmission mechanism, and it has genuine explanatory power. Medieval building guilds were organized precisely to control the transmission of knowledge, to ensure that what master builders knew was passed accurately to apprentices, and that apprentices who had received that knowledge were bound by obligation to maintain its integrity. The guild system created a kind of knowledge infrastructure that could, in principle, maintain specific building practices across wide geographic areas and long historical periods. If the proportional systems, orientation methods, and acoustic principles observed in these buildings were part of the core knowledge curriculum of the guilds, then their appearance in both major and minor buildings across multiple regions makes sense, because wherever guild-trained builders worked, they would have applied the same underlying principles, regardless of the scale or prestige of the project. But this explanation, while useful, immediately raises a further question. Where did the guilds get this knowledge? The guild system, in its well-documented medieval form, is itself a relatively late institution. It became highly organized in the high medieval period, but the buildings with unusual features spanned a much longer period. Some of the most striking examples predate the mature guild system by centuries, which means either that the guilds inherited knowledge from an earlier transmission system, or that some of the knowledge was independently developed before the guilds existed and then absorbed into the guild framework as that framework matured. Either of those possibilities points back toward an origin that is older and less documented than the guilds themselves. And that older origin is the part of the story that remains most obscure. Some researchers working in the field of architectural history have begun to take seriously the possibility that the knowledge embedded in medieval church buildings is more ancient in origin than the standard account acknowledges. This is not a fringe position. It appears in peer-reviewed academic literature and in the work of serious architectural historians who have spent careers studying these structures. The argument is not that medieval builders were receiving direct instruction from ancient civilizations. The argument is more specific and more careful than that. It holds that certain mathematical and geometric principles related to proportion, orientation, and spatial design, were developed in very early periods of human civilization, preserved through various cultural and institutional channels across long stretches of time, and eventually found their way into the hands of medieval builders through routes that are not fully traced in the surviving historical record. The evidence for this argument comes from multiple directions. One line of evidence is the proportional systems themselves. When architectural researchers analyze the specific mathematical ratios used in medieval church buildings and trace their origins, they consistently find connections to systems that appear in much earlier contexts, in ancient Greek architectural theory, in Roman engineering manuals, in Egyptian sacred geometry, in the mathematical traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. These are not vague or approximate connections. They are specific correspondences between the measurements found in medieval buildings and the principles described in ancient sources. The specificity of the correspondence is hard to explain if the connection is coincidental. It is much easier to explain if the principles were transmitted, even if the transmission route is not clearly documented. Another line of evidence comes from the geographic pattern of the features themselves. As noted earlier, the same cluster of unusual characteristics appears in Christian buildings across a remarkably wide range, from northern Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, from the British Isles to the eastern Mediterranean. The breadth of this distribution is difficult to account for through any single medieval transmission network. The geographic range exceeds what the documented guild system covered. It extends into regions where medieval European building traditions had little influence. This suggests that at least some of what these buildings share does not derive from a single medieval source, but from something older and more widely distributed. A body of principles present in multiple ancient cultures before Christianity existed, which then found expression in the sacred architecture of those cultures' descendants, regardless of which specific religion that architecture was built to serve. At first, this seems like an extraordinary claim, but there is a problem with dismissing it too quickly. And that problem is the alternative. The alternative is to explain the wide geographic consistency of these features through coincidence, to argue that builders working independently across very different cultures, without documented contact, arrived at the same specific mathematical ratios, the same acoustic design principles, the same orientation methods, through separate processes that happen to converge on identical results. That alternative requires coincidence to do an enormous amount of work. And the more specific the features being explained, the harder it is to maintain that coincidence is sufficient. Rough similarities can be coincidental. Precise ones are harder to attribute to accident. The idea that certain building knowledge is more systematized and more ancient than official history typically acknowledges appears in mainstream academic writing, but it rarely gets pursued to its logical conclusion in those contexts. It tends to appear as a passing observation, an acknowledgement that the roots of medieval architectural knowledge go deeper than the medieval period itself, and then the discussion moves on without following that thread. Why it is not followed more consistently is itself an interesting question. Some researchers have suggested that pursuing it fully would require engaging with bodies of evidence and scholarly traditions that lie at the edges of mainstream architectural history, ancient mathematical texts, pre-Christian ritual traditions, early medieval esoteric scholarship, and that this interdisciplinary breadth is itself an obstacle to sustained investigation within the specialized framework of conventional academic research. Whatever the reason, the result is a body of literature that acknowledges the depth of the question without fully exploring it. And this matters for the present investigation because it means that the absence of a fully developed mainstream explanation for these features is not necessarily a reflection of the evidence. It may be a reflection of the framework within which the evidence has been examined. A framework that starts with the medieval period and works forward will find certain things and miss others. A framework that starts earlier, that begins with the ancient sources of the knowledge and traces it forward, might find a more complete picture. But that framework has not yet been systematically applied in a way that produces results widely accepted across the relevant scholarly communities. What this means, practically, is that the problem is larger than it first appeared. It is not simply a question of a few unexplained features in a few famous buildings. It is a question about the depth and origin of an entire knowledge system, a system that produced consistent results across a very wide range of buildings, in very different contexts, over a very long period of time. A system that was apparently robust enough to survive the transition from ancient to medieval periods, from pre-Christian to Christian contexts, from elite to ordinary building practice. A system whose existence is implied by the buildings, but whose origins and full character remain inadequately documented. The more ordinary buildings you include in the analysis, the modest parish churches, the rural chapels, the forgotten structures that no guidebook mentions, the wider and deeper the question becomes. And a question that grows consistently as you gather more evidence is one that the current answers have not yet caught up with. When an investigation reaches the point where the standard explanation has been found consistently incomplete, the next natural step is to look at what other explanations exist, not to immediately accept any of them, not to replace one set of confident claims with another, but to examine what serious researchers have proposed when they looked at the same evidence and found the official account insufficient. Because there's rarely only one way to read a complex body of evidence. And in the case of church architecture and its unexplained features, there are several alternative frameworks, each developed by researchers who engaged seriously with the material, each pointing in a somewhat different direction, and none of them fully confirmed by the available evidence. Understanding what these frameworks propose, and where each of them runs into its own difficulties, is an important part of forming an honest picture of where this investigation currently stands. The first thing to establish is that there is no single unified alternative theory. This is worth saying clearly, because investigations of this kind are sometimes presented as if there were, as if the mainstream explanation were simply wrong and one particular alternative were simply right. That framing is inaccurate and unhelpful. What actually exists is a range of interpretations, developed by researchers coming from different disciplines, drawing on different bodies of evidence, and arriving at conclusions that sometimes overlap and sometimes conflict with each other. The disagreements between these alternative interpretations are real and significant. They are not minor variations on a single theme. They reflect genuinely different views about what the evidence means and what kind of explanation would be sufficient to account for it. The first major alternative view begins with the early period of Christian institutional development and focuses on what the church absorbed during that period. As Christianity expanded and gained power in the centuries following Constantine, it did not develop in isolation. It grew in an environment saturated with older intellectual and spiritual traditions, Greek philosophical schools, Egyptian mystery traditions, Neoplatonic philosophy, the ritual systems of the ancient Near East. These traditions were not simply swept away by the rise of Christianity. They persisted. They evolved. And in many cases, scholars and theologians who had been trained in these older systems became Christians while carrying their prior knowledge with them. The early church was not a clean break from everything that preceded it. It was, in significant ways, a continuation and transformation of intellectual currents that were already present in the ancient Mediterranean world. This view holds that certain forms of knowledge, particularly knowledge related to sacred geometry, astronomical cycles, and the design of ritual spaces, were preserved within the early church by individuals who understood their value. These individuals could not transmit this knowledge openly. Some of it came from traditions that official Christian theology had declared incompatible with the faith. Some of it carried associations with pre-Christian religious practices that the church was officially opposed to. So instead of recording it in accessible texts, the argument goes, it was embedded in the physical structures of the buildings themselves, encoded in the proportions, built into the orientations, hidden, in a sense, but hidden in the most permanent and publicly visible medium available, stone. On this reading, the unexplained technical features of church buildings are not accidents or coincidences. They are a deliberate archive, a way of preserving knowledge that could not be safely preserved in any other form. This interpretation has a certain internal logic, and it is supported, indirectly, by the historical record of how knowledge was actually treated during the periods in question. The early medieval period saw significant suppression of texts and traditions that the church deemed incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. Libraries were lost. Philosophical schools were closed. Scholars who worked with certain kinds of knowledge found themselves in difficult or dangerous positions. In that environment, embedding knowledge in architecture rather than writing it down would have been a rational strategy for anyone who wanted to preserve it. The building is harder to burn than a manuscript. It cannot be confiscated or condemned as easily, and it can be read by those who know how to read it, without the reading being visible to anyone watching. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because arguing that knowledge was deliberately encoded in architecture requires demonstrating not just that the knowledge is there, which the acoustic properties and alignments and proportions suggest it is, but that the encoding was intentional. And demonstrating intentionality is one of the hardest things to do with historical evidence. The effect exists. The precision of the effect suggests planning, but planning for an acoustic result is not the same as planning to encode ancient knowledge. The intentionality behind the encoding, the idea that builders were consciously preserving a specific body of esoteric knowledge for future discovery, is the part of this interpretation that goes beyond what the physical evidence directly supports. It is a possible reading of the evidence. It is not the only possible reading. The second major alternative view takes a different approach. Rather than focusing on what the builders knew and intended, it focuses on the properties of the locations themselves. This perspective begins with the observation, which has been discussed earlier in this investigation, that many church sites were considered sacred long before Christianity arrived, and it pushes that observation further, asking whether the sacred status of those locations was connected to something measurable about the physical environment, not just something culturally assigned. Some researchers have investigated whether certain sacred sites demonstrate unusual geophysical characteristics, variations in the local magnetic field, concentrations of specific mineral types in the underlying geology, the presence of underground water sources that affect the surface environment in particular ways. These are not supernatural proposals. They are physical ones, and they have been investigated with physical measurement tools by researchers who approach the question scientifically. The results are genuinely mixed. Some studies have found statistically significant anomalies at certain sacred sites. Others have not. The methodology of the studies has been debated, and the broader claim that ancient people systematically identified locations with unusual geophysical properties and built their sacred structures there remains contested. But the core question that this view raises is worth taking seriously regardless of whether the geophysical hypothesis is confirmed. If multiple unrelated cultures, across long periods of time, repeatedly chose the same locations as sacred, and if those choices preceded any documented cultural transmission that could explain the agreement, then something must have guided those choices. Either it was purely cultural consensus, which is hard to explain without contact between the cultures involved, or it was something about the locations themselves, perceived through whatever combination of sensory and intuitive faculties those cultures possessed. The question of what made those locations feel significant before any single religious tradition had claimed them does not have a settled answer. And without a settled answer to that question, the full significance of church architecture built on those sites remains incomplete. The third alternative interpretation is the most conservative of the three, but in some ways it raises the most direct challenge to the mainstream account. This view does not propose that ancient knowledge was secretly encoded in architecture, or that church sites have special geophysical properties. It simply argues that medieval builders were more skilled and more knowledgeable than the standard historical narrative gives them credit for, and that the gaps in the documentary record are not natural, not simply the result of records failing to survive, but are at least partly the result of deliberate removal. This argument is grounded in documented historical events. The suppression of certain forms of knowledge during the medieval period was real. It was not limited to texts associated with obviously heretical religious positions. It extended to mathematical and philosophical traditions that the Church considered problematic, to the records of certain scholarly communities, and in some cases to the archives of the very building guilds whose work is under examination here. Documents were destroyed. Libraries were dismantled. The circumstances under which certain kinds of knowledge disappeared from the historical record are, in a number of documented cases, not neutral. They involve active decision-making by institutional authorities, who considered the knowledge in question to be better absent than present. If some of the documentation that would explain the technical features of church architecture was deliberately removed, then the gaps in the record are not evidence that the knowledge was primitive or poorly understood. They are evidence of suppression, and suppression implies value. You do not go to the trouble of destroying knowledge that does not matter. The deliberate removal of specific records suggests that those records contain something that someone in a position of authority did not want preserved. What that something was, whether it was specific building techniques, broader philosophical frameworks, connections to older traditions, or something else entirely, is not recoverable from the surviving evidence alone. But the shape of the absence is itself informative. What all three of these interpretations share, and this is the point where they converge despite their differences, is the conclusion that the buildings themselves contain more information than the historical narratives surrounding them acknowledge. Whether that information was deliberately encoded, inherited from geophysically significant locations, or preserved through building practice, despite the loss of written documentation, the result is the same. The physical structures have outlasted the explanations attached to them. The stone remembers more than the archive does, and reading what the stone contains requires tools and frameworks that go beyond the standard approach of tracing documentary evidence through institutional records. This is not a comfortable conclusion for any interpretive framework, including the alternative ones. The first view, deliberate encoding, cannot fully confirm the intentionality it requires. The second view, geophysical significance, cannot yet produce the consistent empirical evidence that would validate it across a sufficient range of sites. The third view, deliberate suppression, can point to documented instances of knowledge removal, but cannot reconstruct what was removed. All three views are better at identifying problems with the standard account than at providing complete replacements for it. And this shared limitation is honest. It reflects the actual state of the evidence, which is genuinely insufficient to confirm any single framework. What the alternative views collectively contribute is a set of more complete questions. The standard account asks what these buildings were built for and answers with theology and institutional need. The alternatives ask what knowledge went into building them, where that knowledge originated, how it was transmitted, and why its documentation is so consistently incomplete. Those are different questions. They point toward different kinds of evidence, and they remain, for the most part, unanswered, not because researchers have not tried to answer them, but because the evidence available is not yet sufficient to close the gaps that the questions identify. Each of the researchers who has developed these alternative frameworks has contributed something real to the investigation. Each has identified a dimension of the problem that the standard account leaves unaddressed, and each has encountered the same fundamental obstacle. The buildings are more legible than the history surrounding them, and the history is not yet detailed enough to catch up with what the buildings contain. That gap between the physical evidence in the structures and the documentary evidence in the archives is where the most important questions in this investigation currently live, and it is a gap that none of the existing frameworks, alternative or mainstream, has yet fully bridged. After spending this much time with the evidence, examining the acoustic properties, the solar alignments, the mathematical proportions, the layered sacred sites, the underground chambers, the geometric markings, the repeating patterns across buildings, separated by vast distances of geography and time, it is worth stepping back and asking an honest question. Not a dramatic one, just an honest one. Where does all of this actually leave us? The answer, stated plainly, is this. It leaves us with genuine questions that do not yet have complete answers. Not invented questions. Not questions manufactured for effect. Genuine ones, raised by serious researchers working in architecture, archaeology, history, and related fields, who looked at the physical evidence in these buildings and found that the standard explanations did not fully account for what they were seeing. Those researchers did not all agree with each other about what the evidence means. They did not collectively arrive at a single alternative conclusion, but they did agree consistently that the questions were real, that the features they were examining deserved more thorough examination than the mainstream account had provided. And that agreement, across researchers who otherwise disagreed about interpretations, is itself significant. It is important to be precise about what kind of questions these are. They are not questions about whether these buildings are impressive. They clearly are. They are not questions about whether the people who built them were skilled. They clearly were. The questions are narrower and more specific than that. They are questions about the source and nature of the knowledge that produced certain technical features, features whose precision and sophistication exceed what the documented knowledge base of the relevant periods should have been able to generate. They are questions about the origin of proportional systems that appear consistently across buildings with no documented connection. They are questions about the intention behind solar alignments so precise that chance cannot plausibly explain them, yet so undocumented that written confirmation of their intent does not survive. These are technical questions about specific, measurable characteristics of real buildings, and they remain, despite the volume of scholarship that has been applied to these structures, incompletely answered. The question of the acoustic properties, examined early in this investigation, still does not have a fully satisfying resolution. The acoustic effects are measurable and confirmed. Modern acoustic researchers have studied them, described them, and in some cases struggled to replicate them in contemporary construction. The standard explanation, trial and error, accumulated craft experience, does not adequately account for the consistency and sophistication of the results, particularly in the early examples where the learning process would not yet have had sufficient time to produce outcomes of that caliber, where the acoustic knowledge came from, how it was held and transmitted, and whether its application was purely practical or connected to a broader understanding of how sound affects human experience. These questions remain open, not for lack of interest, for lack of sufficient evidence to close them definitively. The astronomical alignments present a similar situation. The alignments are real. Their precision is documented. The technical knowledge required to achieve them, solar astronomy, geometric planning, precise measurement, is established. What is not established is the intention behind them. The documentary record does not contain the evidence that would confirm what the builders had in mind when they designed these alignments. The gap between the physical effect and the recorded intention remains, and the fact that this gap appears consistently across multiple buildings in multiple countries over multiple centuries makes it impossible to attribute to simple accident of archival survival. Something systematic is happening. What it is exactly continues to be debated. The proportional systems raise a question that goes to the very foundation of how medieval building knowledge is understood. Specific mathematical ratios appearing consistently across buildings with no documented connection should not be possible if those ratios were independently invented by separate builders in separate regions. The level of specificity involved rules out coincidence as a complete explanation. Some form of transmission must account for the consistency. The guild system provides a partial answer for some of the cases, but not all of them, particularly not the early ones, where the guild system had not yet reached the organizational level required for that kind of consistent knowledge transmission over wide geographic areas. The origin of those ratios, what ancient tradition they drew from, and through what channels they reached the hands of medieval builders, is a question that the current historical record cannot fully answer. The layered sacred sites add a dimension to the problem that is perhaps the most difficult of all to investigate, because it requires looking beneath the buildings that exist into the ground below them, and the evidence at that level is often fragmentary, contested, and resistant to confident interpretation. What can be said is that the pattern is real. Multiple unrelated cultures, across long stretches of time, identified the same locations as significant. The reasons for the earliest identifications, the very first choices, made by communities whose records do not survive, are unknown, and without understanding those original choices, the full significance of what was eventually built on those sites remains incomplete. The chain of use is visible. The beginning of the chain is not. The underground chambers and their geometric markings present the most direct physical evidence that something in these buildings does not fit neatly into the standard account. Markings that match across traditions, which are not supposed to be connected. Pre-Christian megalithic sites, ancient Mediterranean mathematical manuscripts, structures from multiple unrelated cultures, are not easily explained by any single framework. The mainstream account does not address them in detail. The alternative frameworks address them in ways that are suggestive, but not confirmed. What the markings mean, why they appear where they do, and what connection they represent between traditions that official history treats as separate. These questions sit at the bottom of the problem, literally and figuratively, and the evidence available to answer them is thin. Some researchers who have spent careers examining these questions have come to believe that the answers have been genuinely lost, that the knowledge embodied in these buildings was once more fully documented and understood, but that documents were destroyed, traditions were interrupted, and the institutional memory that would have made sense of the technical features was severed during periods of significant cultural disruption. On this view, the gaps in the record are real gaps. They represent actual losses that cannot be recovered through any amount of additional archival research, because the material that would fill them no longer exists. The buildings contain more information than the historical record does simply because stone outlasts paper, and the forces that destroy documents did not destroy structures. Others hold a different view. They believe the answers have not been lost but set aside, that certain institutions or scholarly traditions possess a more complete understanding of these features than is publicly acknowledged, and that for reasons related to institutional interest or doctrinal concern, that understanding has not been brought fully into the public scholarly conversation. This is a more contentious position, and it is one that is very difficult to either confirm or rule out with available evidence. What can be said is that the history of how certain kinds of knowledge have been managed by powerful institutions is not entirely reassuring on this point. Deliberate suppression of inconvenient knowledge has occurred. It is documented in specific cases. Whether it explains the current gaps in the record of church architectural knowledge is a question that cannot be definitively answered from the outside. A third group takes a more optimistic position. They believe the standard historical account is simply incomplete, not wrong in what it says, but insufficient in what it has so far examined. On this view, the gaps will eventually be filled by continued research. New excavations will reveal more about the pre-Christian layers beneath significant sites. New analysis of surviving manuscripts will clarify the transmission routes of mathematical and astronomical knowledge into medieval building practice. New applications of measurement technology to existing buildings will produce data that makes the proportional systems and alignments easier to trace to their origins. The questions are real on this view, but they are answerable. They're just not yet answered, because the research has not yet gone far enough. This is perhaps the most comfortable of the three positions, and it may be correct. Research does progress. Questions that seem permanently open sometimes close, given sufficient time and attention and the right methodological tools. It would be wrong to assume that the current state of incomplete understanding is necessarily the final state. The history of scholarship is full of examples where persistent investigation eventually produced satisfying answers to questions that had seemed intractable. But it is also worth noting that these particular questions have been circulating in the relevant scholarly communities for a considerable period of time. The unusual features of historic church buildings have been observed and remarked upon for generations of researchers. The gaps between the physical evidence and the documentary record have been noted repeatedly, and despite sustained attention from multiple disciplines, the core questions have not closed. They have remained open, and in some respects have deepened as better measurement tools have revealed more precise versions of the features that need explaining. Questions that deepen with investigation rather than resolving are not necessarily unanswerable, but they may require a fundamentally different approach to answer. Not just more of the same research, but research that starts from different assumptions or draws on different frameworks. What remains, after all of this, is a set of structures, physical objects, stone and mortar and glass, assembled with extraordinary care and precision, in locations chosen for reasons that are not fully understood, according to principles that are not fully documented, producing effects that are not fully explained. The buildings are there. The features are there. The questions are there, and none of the three, the buildings, the features, or the questions, shows any sign of going away. This is where the investigation is genuinely useful, even without a resolution, because the value of asking these questions is not only in the answers they might eventually produce, it is in the quality of attention they require. These buildings have been present for centuries, in some cases for over 1,000 years. Most people who encounter them, whether as casual visitors or as lifelong residents of the towns where they stand, see them as familiar objects. Known, understood, part of the background of the world. What the questions examined in this investigation suggest is that the familiarity is misleading, that these structures contain dimensions that are not visible on a casual pass, that paying closer attention, looking at the acoustic behavior of the space, noticing the quality of light at different times of year, considering what lies beneath the floor, wondering about the mathematical relationships between the walls, might reveal a building that is considerably more complex than it appears. And this applies not only to the famous examples, not only to the cathedrals that appear in travel guides and art history textbooks. It applies to the small ones, the ordinary ones, the modest parish church in a quiet town, the chapel at the edge of a rural village, the unremarkable building that has stood in the same spot for 800 years without attracting particular scholarly attention. These buildings are everywhere. And if the patterns identified in the more famous examples extend into the ordinary ones, which the evidence suggests they do, then the question of what these structures actually are and what they actually contain is not a specialized academic concern. It is a question about buildings that most people in the Western world have walked past or walked into at some point in their lives. What exactly are you standing inside when you stand in one of these structures? The official answer is clear and well documented. It is a building for worship, a space designed to serve the needs of a religious community. That answer is not false, but the evidence examined through this investigation suggests it may not be complete. There may be layers to these buildings, technical, historical, mathematical, even physical, that the standard account does not fully capture. And those layers, whatever they ultimately turn out to contain, have been standing in plain sight for a very long time, waiting for the questions that would make them legible. The questions are now visible. The answers, for the most part, are not. And that gap between the questions these buildings raise and the explanations currently available remains one of the more genuinely interesting unresolved problems in the study of the human past.